welcome back to Just Books. One of the most unusual and even possibly esoteric art books of the year is dedicated to the great early 20th century mystic, explorer, adventurer and artist, the Russian Nicholas Roerich, whose art is really indivisibly part of India, particularly his extraordinarily vivid Himalayan landscapes. Researcher and short story writer Manju Kak has now edited an extraordinary volume on the life, times and art of Nicholas Roerich. It's called A Quest and a Legacy. Manju, it's an astonishing book because really Roerich, father and son, Nicholas and Svetoslav married the first lady of Indian cinema, Devika Rani later, are very well-known figures in 20th century Indian art. Yet there hasn't been any serious study about their work, though they were cult figures during their lifetime, this Russian family. What took you down this journey to explore the life and art of Nicholas Roerich?
Roerich is, something about Roerich is spiritual, and when you look at his paintings, there's an instant connect for those who have this love for the mountains. And it was really looking at his paintings in the Allahabad Museum and in other museums that just gave me the idea almost 20 years ago that I would either like to paint like him or, failing which, maybe research or write about him.
And Nicholas Roerich himself is actually a riveting figure. He begins his life in Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, then becomes involved in a huge early 20th century Russian Renaissance, working with people like Igor Stravinsky, Sergei Diaghilev, the great impresario of the Ballet Russe, many wonderful people, Sir Thomas Beecham, designing the most magnificent stage sets in his unique, vivid, bold style. What brought him to India in 1923?
Essentially, it was perhaps the Bolshevik Revolution. But before the Bolshevik Revolution, he was interested in India and Oriental philosophies. And he had been delving in that. His wife, Helena, had been translating Madame Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine. They were both interested in Buddhism, and they both conceived of a vast sort of Buddhist empire, a Tsarist Buddhist empire that would be located somewhere between Siberia and Mongolia. So there was this essential Buddhist avatar within him that was struggling to get out. And the Bolshevik Revolution kind of moved him away from Tsarist Russia to look for other places.
Right. So, I mean, what's fascinating is that, as you mentioned, Madame Blavatsky, Alexandra David Neal, all very unique figures thrown up in the West in search of kind of Oriental spiritual exploration. And then they also become involved with people like Rabindranath Tagore, with sort of key Renaissance figures of 20th century India. But in the Roerich case, what's riveting is also his role as an explorer. Here is this man in the thick of the great game in the early 20th century, is exploring inner Mongolia, the Gobi Desert, deep into the recesses of Chinese Turkestan. What was this combination of explorer, artist and spiritualist?
He was actually looking for the ethnogenesis of peoples and cultures, which is what he was interested in. And he felt that there were some common roots, especially roots that Western contemporary Russia, which was always looking to Paris, to London for their cultural indices, had ignored. And it was finding these roots that took him onto these absolutely astonishing journeys. In that, he was also looking for what we later know as Shambhala, which is the legendary Shangri-La that was written about in Lost Horizons.
Which was more spiritual quest rather than actually a kind of James Hilton physical landscape.
Yes. I think he also studied the Kal Chakra doctrines, in which there's more discussion on Shambhala in its physical sense, and he was absolutely convinced that it did exist. And he went looking for this legendary white waters, or what we call Meru, or the land of the spiritual, and it took him, it was like a magnet attracting him. And that is quite natural in an artist, because an artist always looks for the inner in the outer. So he looks for those physical, geographical spaces that actually his soul is questing for. And he demonstrates it in his paintings, but also in the way he travels.
Right, that's very vividly put. It's very interestingly put, the inner journey. And that comes through very beautifully in your compendium on Nicholas Roerich, his quest and legacy. But what is unique, of course, is the actual vivid manifestation of this huge corpus of artwork that he left behind. 7,000 artworks. And they are really bewitching. Those colors of the Himalayan landscapes, many people have tried to copy them. But those sunset, those moon rises, those pinks, those jagged peaks, how did he develop that style? What is that Roerich style of mountainscapes?
In a sense, it is primitive. It doesn't belong to any ism, which was prevalent in those days.
Mind you, he was a very sophisticated artist, because as I mentioned, he had worked with people like Stravinsky, with Diaghilev, with Thomas Beecham. So they were very sophisticated, though they may have seen the East as an Orientalist fantasy. But they were very assured artists in their own right.
I don't find, Sunil, there's anything between his eye as an artist and his interpretation of the natural beauty of the mountains that he sees. When I say primitive, I mean that he expresses it entirely in its honesty. He doesn't allow for any intellectualism to decode them and construct them in a narrative that requires an intellectual exercise to experience. It is almost like soul speaking to soul. And in that, when he creates those landscapes, he is one with what he actually has seen and experienced. That has to be a spiritual journey. It cannot alone be an artistic experience.
Among the legacy, or the legatee, that the late and great Nicholas Roerich left behind, he died in the mid-40s, was of course his remarkable son Svetoslav Roerich, who again became a very influential figure in post-independence Indian art, a kind of revered Russian emigre who not only ceaselessly painted portraits of his father, but also continued in his father's style with his fascination, almost obsession with the Himalayas. And of course, to add a very glamorous touch, he then married the infinitely beautiful and wealthy Devika Rani, the screen star and Bombay film producer. How do you see this connection between father and son and their persistent legacy?
The father's was a much more immediate concern and interest in the vast barren spaces. And despite the fact that there were mountains, you find that it is really the barrenness of those landscapes, peopled with spiritual figures, hierarchs, monks, lamas, that are the central pieces of his paintings. His son, Svetoslav, is actually there is much more of nature in its abundance, foliage in its abundance, the colors that are diverse and not moving towards a apex point, in which in Roerich's landscapes would always be the mountain. So there is this essential difference in the way they view nature and the force of nature, which is what I find.
Right. Quick question. Here are these two very influential figures, Russian emigres who make India and the Himalayas their home throughout the course of the 20th century, as it were. Why have they gone out of fashion?
I think a lot of art has become intellectual. A lot of art has become conceptualized. And today it is not really just the senses and the sensual experience that dominates art, but its interpretation in the sense of its, as I mentioned, the intellectualization of art.
Right. Also, in some ways, I suppose, in post-independence art, it in some ways became overtly political, as it were, nationalist, or even one would argue very internal, abstractionist, and so on. Whereas these two fellows, the Roerichs, were really pursuing a different vision. It was a visionary art.
For that matter, I think Roerich was not very popular in Europe, and there was no real perception of what he was trying to depict, because there was no real understanding of the spiritual legacy of the East, so to speak. And that is a time when you had Dadaism, Fauvism, you had Picasso, you had so many other involvements of artists with the Spanish Civil War, with the fascists and the communists and other things. So there was a sense of mission in their work. And mission was also, as you just said, with the political sense or with the socialist understanding of what art was supposed to achieve, and in constructing nations, in constructing peoples, in resurrecting.
Art is message.
Yes.
Whereas the Roerichs are really operating with a kind of vision, as I said, which is personal, questing, spiritual, and largely dedicated to nature and landscape.
I think so. I think even as in with the Sufi or the other esoteric, mystical aspects of religion and philosophical thought, they are always removed from the so-called reality of our political and social existences as we see them. And it goes into the realm of the worlds that we don't perceive. Roerich was essentially occupied with the realms of the worlds we don't perceive in our immediate senses. And therefore, to some extent, he had removed himself from what was the immediate. But there's a sense of premonition, a sense of warning in nearly all his paintings, a sense of doomsday. And this always takes you back to what was happening in Europe between the two wars, and his own sense of understanding what Russia is going through, was going through, would go through. So, though it was not directly alluding to what was happening in Russia, and therefore was not...
Or indeed in India.
Or in India, and therefore was not directly connected with those nationalists or fascists or communist movements, there was the sense of the world in a crucible about to explode, and something would emerge from it that was whole and more larger and more significant.
Well, it's absolutely fascinating what you've done in resurrecting the artistic, spiritual and Himalayan odyssey of the Roerichs, father and son. And thank you for putting it together in a quest and a legacy, because yours has been a unique quest in search of this artist's family. Manju Kak, all the best for your book, and thank you so much for talking to us about it.
Thank you.
That's all for now, but I'll be back next weekend with another edition of Just Books. Until then, from all of us here at NDTV,